And so very good to have Jamie Chaffey, the president of the Country Mayors Association, joining us here today. We've got a very broad audience. I know we've got guests joining us from Japan, so welcome. Zooming in from Tokyo this morning. Great to have you join us. I must say from the start that Dr. Richard Buttery, who was going to be speaking with us today, has just had to jump on a plane in San Diego, so he won't be joining us today. But it looks like Matthew, I think he'll be joining us next month, so we'll look forward to catching up with Richard and the latest with what's happening in San Diego. We've also got Ian Hudson from the Industry Capability Network who is joining us. And so, Jamie, please ask any questions of Matthew throughout, but very pleased to introduce Matthew Hall, who's from ANU in Canberra, and today you're zooming in from Canberra, mate. I think you said it's -1 degrees there this morning. So
that's right, yeah.
And we're pretty lucky to have you here this month because next month you'll be on the ski slopes. So this is winter in Australia for those joining us from international places. Matthew, could you give us a brief introduction about yourself and your work and what's happening at ANU? And I guess then we'll look at your presentation around all this latest work with fusion technologies. Over to you.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm a professor at ANU. I work in fusion energy science. I've been at the ANU since around about 2005. And prior to that, I was working at the UK Atomic Energy Authority, actually with Richard Buttery. So I know Richard very well. Maybe you could give some context as to how you bumped into Richard.
It's a great story, actually, because these nuclear Zoom sessions have been going gangbusters. And through our LinkedIn platform with the AUKUS forum page, it's growing. We've got hundreds of people joining every day, which is just terrific. And Richard was one of them. So Richard reached out to me and we ended up having a Zoom call. It was quite funny because he was sitting in his car in a Walmart car park talking to me about fusion technology and all the work they're doing with their new reactors technology. So the best part was he was very much able to simplify the technology so that someone like I could understand it. And so we're certainly looking forward to you, Matthew, sharing the work that you're doing at the Australian National University. But also we talked with Richard about the opportunity through AUKUS to be able to lift all boats and talk about fusion technologies across the UK, the US and Australia, and how between the three AUKUS nations we could really benefit from that research and the technology that's going to come down the line. So certainly lots of opportunities, and we're looking forward to visiting Richard in the near future on the stateside. But yeah, really around fusion, my takeaway was that the difference between fusion and other technologies is the limited waste, because here in Australia, the thing that people bring up most of the time is, what about nuclear waste? And so if fusion is a new technology that will come down the line in a different way, we'd certainly like to hear more about that.
Yeah, certainly. So I have a presentation which I can share with you, which talks a little bit about the background of what fusion energy is. So you should be able to see my screen now, I think.
Yes.
Great, fantastic. So as I said, I'm a professor at ANU. I've worked there for a number of years. I've also been quite instrumental in trying to engage Australia into the Next Step ITER project, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So let's see if I can advance my slides. So fusion is the opposite process to fission. Fission is the fragmentation of typically heavy isotopes of uranium into smaller daughter nuclides, and both produce power or net energy yield in the reaction. But the reaction for fusion versus fission is the combination typically of light isotopes of hydrogen, in this case deuterium and tritium. There are other reactions, of course, all the way down to iron that produce net energy. But if you combine deuterium and tritium, this is the easiest one to initiate. It produces an energetic helium, ion, and a neutron. So the advantage is the process that powers the sun and the stars. The sun is powered by the proton-proton reaction. But the easiest one, which is to initiate, is the DT reaction. And if you could power this on Earth, you would have large-scale energy production. Because hydrogen is, nearly 99% of the universe is hydrogen, and every single hydrogen atom, every 6,000 hydrogen atoms is a single deuterium. So this energy source is plentiful. It will never run out, ever. It's essentially limitless fuel available all over the world. It doesn't produce greenhouse gases, as neither does fission either. It's intrinsically safe simply because the challenge of fusion is getting the reaction to work, as I'll talk about in a moment, because it requires a very high energy barrier to initiate the reaction. And the consequence of that is that it is difficult to sustain and keep going. So there's no chain reaction possibility. The challenge is keeping it going. And it doesn't have long-lived radioactive waste. Depending upon the process, the deuterium-tritium reaction does generate this energetic neutron, and this energetic neutron can activate part of the first wall of a reactor. And so over time, the reactor wall will become activated, but it's the vessel itself that's become activated, not the spent fuel itself. And so the magnitude of the problem is significantly less. So there are lots of studies that suggest that within 50 or 100 years of shutdown of a fusion reactor, you would have back to greenfield site again. So the volume of radioactive waste is tiny by comparison, and the time span is very much less. And if you go to advanced, more and more advanced fusion reactions, if you go to aneutronic reactions, there's no waste at all. So that's the appeal. And if you look at the energy density, I mean, the energy density per mass of reaction for fusion is about 4 times that of fission of uranium. So if you combine the amount of deuterium plus the amount of lithium in a laptop computer battery and deuterium in half a bath of water, it can provide enough fusion power to last an average person for 30 years.
So, Matthew, I will ask you on that point around fission versus fusion. Could you just explain the difference between fission and fusion for us?
So this was the difference. So fusion is the combination of light isotopes. So here I've got your deuterium and tritium ion. So these are isotopes of hydrogen. They combine in a fusion reaction to form helium, which is a heavier product, and an energetic neutron. So that's fusion, the combination of light isotopes to form something heavier. Fission, which is what powers most nuclear reactors, including a nuclear submarine reactor, is the decomposition or fragmentation, spontaneous decomposition of uranium into lighter fragments. Both produce net power. So fission isotopes or elements above iron will undergo fission. Elements below that will produce power if they undergo fusion.
And so it's fission, as you say, we're currently using in the nuclear submarines, and
That's right.
Fission is what will be used for small modular reactors and others.
So this is demonstrated technology. This works. So, I mean, that's worked since more or less the 1950s. Fusion is the opposite process. Fusion clearly does work. If I look up at the sun, it's a giant fusion reactor in the sky. It clearly does work. The challenge is finding the conditions on Earth to make this sustainable and continuously operating.
Okay.
So both reactions work, but they require different conditions under which to thrive or initiate.
Okay, thank you for that. And certainly for Jamie and Ian Hudson, feel free to ask questions throughout. Matthew's happy to take your questions through this conversation.
Yep,
Thank you, Matthew.
Yep. So I mentioned that tritium is one of the fuel ions. Tritium doesn't exist in nature. It has a half-life of 12.5 years. So you need to manufacture it, and you manufacture it by activating lithium. So lithium is the material which is commonly used in batteries, in my laptop, for example. And so this slide was to try and give an estimate of the energy density. So both fission and fusion are incredibly energy dense. That's why they are very useful in a submarine, and why many industrial nations are interested in both of those technologies, because they produce very large energy supply at very small amounts of fuel. So the challenge mostly of fusion is that in order to initiate the reaction, I can't go forward now, I've got 2 light particles together, and they're positively charged. So they don't want to come together. The only way I can force a reaction to occur is that I get them sufficiently close to allow the strong nuclear binding force to take over, and that will cause a reaction to fuse. So to do that, I need very high temperature, which means I need to exceed this barrier, this potential barrier that I mentioned. The density is proportional to the energy yield, and I need what's called a large energy confinement time. So if I boil my jug in the kitchen and I look at the amount of time it takes for that jug to cool down, that's a measure of the energy confinement time. That's an insulation parameter. So I need the product of these 3 terms to be very high. And if I look at this cross-section of reaction, this is the probability of reaction for the different fusion reactions. They peak at, for the deuterium-tritium at 600 million degrees centigrade. So you look at it and say, well, this is an insane temperature. That's why fusion works in stars, because stars are very hot. Turns out stars are nowhere near this hot. The sun is incredibly dense, so it doesn't need to be anywhere near that higher temperature. And it's also burning the proton-proton cycle. And it's also not even doing, it's actually working by quantum tunneling, but that's a different topic altogether.
Mm-hmm.
What I wanted to get away from this slide was that it has to be hot, it turns out it doesn't have to be this hot. And I need a density which is large, and I need this energy confinement time to be large. And if I fold all these parameters together, I get a power balance condition, which tells me this term has to be bigger than this threshold. It turns out the temperature doesn't need to be quite that high, because this product of density and energy confinement time has a minimum at about 150 million degrees centigrade. So the challenge is to try and find, can you confine a hot plasma at 150 million degrees in steady state? Because that's what you need to make a functioning fusion power plant.
Doesn't sound difficult. Doesn't sound difficult at all, mate.
Well, you know, it turns out you can do this. The challenge is trying to do it in steady state, in part, and trying to do it in a way that is producing net power. Mm-hmm. So, but experiments have approached this condition. So we can achieve this condition. What we have yet to achieve is this threshold of continuous power, and that's what this next step fusion experiment will do.
Okay, we do have a question here, Matthew, from David Clementson. One, he's asking how much lithium would be required to sustain a reactor. And then, David, you've joined us here. I see you've got your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question other than that?
Yeah, I have another question. Are there ways to have they also looked at increasing the density so that in a reactor, so that they don't require the amount of heat?
So yeah, they're both good questions. I guess to turn to the first question, the amount of fuel in the fusion reactor at any one time is relatively small. So I mean, the deuterium, and I mean, there's way less than a kilo of fuel in the machine at any one time. Right. So the amount of tritium and lithium is a small amount, and the amount that's being burnt is even smaller. So the fuel requirement is very small. It's significantly less than that of uranium. To turn to your second question, density. The challenge is more that this density product, Nd tau E, has a minimum at this temperature. So you can raise the density, which will increase the energy yield. It won't necessarily reduce the threshold temperature, because that threshold temperature is, I said you had to exceed this Coulomb barrier. Yeah. So the way the sun works is because the density is about 100 times that of iron. So right. in the core of the sun, and the sun is not actually operating even by Coulomb barrier, it's operating by quantum tunneling. So the sun, the probability of reaction, if you just looked at the Coulomb barrier for the sun shouldn't ignite. The reason why it does is because it's enormous. And secondly, it's not actually, most of the reactions aren't exceeding the Coulomb barrier, they're quantum tunneling through the Coulomb barrier, because the density is very large. So that's a different environment. Yes, that would be wonderful to do. That's even harder. So we're trying the simplest thing we can first.
Thank you, Matthew, for that. Jamie has a question also. Please, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I'd be keen to some of the trial work you spoke about, if you could maybe expand on where that's been done and what that actually looks like, and also the inputs to be able to get to that type of heat that you're talking about. What would be required, obviously, for our membership being representative of regional New South Wales, and we were always very keen as we produce all of the food, fibre and the energy for the state of New South Wales, looking for new technology and what's coming around the corner to try and position ourselves in the best place we can to, be the centre of that technology or generation into the future. So I'm sure our members would be very keen to know how far down the track we are, what it looks like as far as into the future, how long it would take for this type of new technology, and what would the inputs be?
Yeah, so certainly this is covered in the presentation. Maybe if I haven't spanned it by the end, we can come back and ask the question. That would be the right way. I think that would be the easiest way of doing it.
I think that's great, Matthew, and certainly some of the stuff we're touching on with Richard last week. So I'm sure there's plenty to come. Thank you for that, Jamie.
Yep. Okay, so maybe I'll just keep going for the moment. Yep. So I mentioned that this temperature is not as high as a requirement, but nonetheless, if you go to these very high states of very high temperatures, you form a plasma. So plasma is an ionized gas. If I look in the room, all the electrons are bound to the ions. So if I apply a magnetic field, nothing will happen. But if I heat the temperature to very high conditions, the electrons will dissociate from the ions, and you'll have a soup of electrons and ions. If you apply a magnetic field, the ions and electrons will gyrate around the magnetic field. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to confine this very high temperature plasma. And the leading process to do this is magnetic confinement. It turns out that most of the universe is in this state. So you might think plasma is some exotic matter. It's not. Most of the visible universe is in a plasma state because it's an ionized gas, and most of the visible universe is seen by stellar emission. So I mentioned you've got very strong you've got this magnetic field line. So ions and electrons are gyrating around the magnetic field line. So if I had a straight magnetic field, what would happen is that the particles would be confined, but they would just impinge upon the wall. So the easiest way to confine a plasma in steady state is to use toroidal magnetic confinement. So you bend this into a torus. So you have a giant donut shape where the magnetic field twists in both the long direction and short direction, and the ions and electrons, the charged particles, are confined. They gyrate or circulate around these magnetic field lines. The neutrons, however, have no charge at all, so they just go straight through the plasma. And the neutrons are, in fact, carrying most of the energy out from the reaction. So this DT reaction, most of the energy is in the neutron. So 14.5 MeV is in the neutron, only 3.5 is in the captured alpha. So the alpha is used to self-heat the plasma. Most of the energy is carried by the neutron. These neutrons escape, they impact the wall, they heat the wall, and then you use a steam cycle or some sort of energy, a thermal blanket to heat a medium which is used to drive a steam turbine. So in some sense you have 21st century technology meets Maxwell, the steam engine, because at the end of the day, you're heating, it's a giant heat source, and you're driving a steam turbine. But that's the general idea of how you use magnetic confinement to confine this very high temperature plasma.
That's exactly how I thought it would be, actually, Matthew.
That's great. And so there's a question about heating. How do you heat it to these very high temperatures? So you have to get to 150 million degrees centigrade. So you use normally 3 different approaches, one of which is ohmic heating. So if I have a wire and I pass a current through it, the wire will heat up. That has a natural limit of around about what we would call 4 kilo electron volts, around about 1 kilo electron volt is about 11,000. So 4,000 is about 40 million degrees. That will limit. It won't heat any further than that. The other 2 approaches is by electromagnetic wave heating. So a microwave, if I use a microwave and heat my food, this is exactly the same technology. It's coupling at different frequencies because you want to ideally use either resonant, which means the wave is resonant with particle motion, or possibly non-resonant, but resonant is more effective, heating, or you could use injection of neutral particle beams. So this is literally billiard ball physics. If I go to a billiard ball and a billiard table and I fire my cue into a bunch of other particles, the other particles will move along. So in this case, what happens is I have an accelerator. I can't put charged particles into the plasma because they'll just be deflected. So I have some neutralizer, and I have this energetic beam of neutrals that impacts the plasma. I then have some charge exchange reaction. The energetic neutrons are captured, or energetic neutrals are captured by the plasma, and they undergo some charge exchange reaction there. And the fourth method, of course, is the fusion heating reaction. So those are the ways in which I'm able to heat the plasma to these conditions. And we can do this. We can heat the temperature to the required conditions necessary for fusion power to work. What we have not yet done is done all of those conditions simultaneously: high density, high temperature, and high energy confinement time. But it does nonetheless work. So the other part I mentioned is this energy confinement time. So it turns out that bigger is better. And the simple way to think about this, I mentioned this energy confinement time, which is like an insulation parameter. So the bigger I make my plasma, the bigger the volume. The volume goes like R to the power 3. The surface area goes like R squared. So the bigger I make the plasma, the bigger the insulation parameter of this energy confinement scaling. It's also proportional to the amount of current going through it and the field strength. Now, if I look at this picture over here, which shows this sort of this power gain, or this energy, this power gain triple product threshold versus ion temperature, and there's a whole bunch of data points on this. All I really want you to point out is that these contours show power gain regimes. So this power gain regime is a power gain of 0.1. Here's the power gain of unity. So we're just below the power gain of unity, except for the National Ignition Facility, which is a laser facility. But the ITER project and this SPARC experiment, which is being constructed at MIT, will have a power gain of the order of 10 for not quite continuous operation, but very close to it. So far we've demonstrated a power gain of 0.7 in the Joint European Torus, which has come to the end of its life in the UK. This burning regime, where most of the heating, equivalent heating from the confined alphas to the external heating, is coming from the energetic alphas. So this is this burning regime, which is this next step experiment. So to cut a long story short, the point is the experiments to date have gone slightly under power gain unity. The next step experiment, which is this ITER project, which will come online, I don't know, it's been nearly 85% constructed now, will produce power gain ratio of 5, between 5 and 10, as will SPARC, which is this independent private venture in MIT, and the National Ignition Facility, which I'll talk a little bit about maybe later, is as a laser facility that has produced some power gain of around about 2 or so. But that's different technology, and that's intrinsically pulsed. So the challenge from turning that from a steady state and turning that into a steady state power plant is even harder. So here's some relatively recent results. So this Joint European Torus, this is from 2022, produced this high power, produced the highest fusion power produced and sustained for 5 seconds. So these are different DT campaigns, or deuterium tritium campaigns. This is the one that produced the power gain of 0.7. These more recent experiments have produced the largest amount of confined or total stored energy to date. So they're confirming that the behavior of the plasma advances. It's confirming that we believe we understand what will happen if we operate ITER. We're not completely convinced. That's why it's an experiment. But there has been significant progress experimentally in the last 20 years. I mentioned also that there has been some demonstration of ignition. This was done by the Lawrence Livermore National Ignition Facility. They fire a whole bunch of lasers to a spherical target, and they use a hologram, which is some sort of cylinder where they shine light onto the uniform ends of the hologram and cause radiation or indirect radiation pressure to reach ignition. So this is the same technology that would be used in a bomb. In fact, the National Ignition Facility is funded primarily by the US Department of Defense to maintain their nuclear capability for maintaining a weapon capability. So it's a different technology. There are pathways in which you can turn that into a power plant. They are, from my point of view, even harder, because you have to shine all of these lasers down to a uniform target. The target is sensitive to Rayleigh-Taylor type density perturbations, so it has to be extremely well focused, and you have to do this 10 times a second to produce power. In addition, the lasers are quite inefficient. The lasers efficiency is around about 10% or so. So, you know, there is, suffice to say, there is another technology pathway, but it's hard.
We have a question there from Greg, so please go ahead, Greg.
Hi, Matthew. Good to see you again. Just to so we are a laser fusion company based in Sydney. So I won't jump into the presentation now, but I would make the case that laser fusion has pathways to energy gain as well.
Yeah, I didn't say it didn't. I said it was, from my point of view, harder.
Yeah.
Simply because you have to do this at 10 hertz.
Ours is based at 1 hertz, but still. Yeah.
But
We
well,
probably beg to differ, but hopefully we'll get an opportunity to talk to this forum at a later stage. So
we can do that for sure, and definitely this is the reason for holding these nuclear sessions.
I'm not saying there's not a pathway there. From my point of view, I believe it's harder.
Yep.
And thanks, Matthew. It's a great presentation.
This is the reason for these sessions is, in my view, I get to walk the factory floors all over Australia, and then to have conversations with people in the UK and the US now through AUKUS is just fantastic. But my vision is to be able to share this research and this technology being developed right here in this country. So across the board, I want to learn about this, and I know that having Jamie Chaffee here from the Country Mayors Association is terrific, and Ian Hudson is on our nuclear task force with us also. Ian and I have been walking the factory floors all over New South Wales in recent months, and there's such a thirst for information out there. So we're really grateful to have you sharing this one here today, Matthew, and I've got no doubt that the team from HB11 will be talking with him in the near future too. So thank you for that.
Right. Yep, that's all good. Yeah, it's all good. Okay, so let's get going. So I mentioned that, so this next step experiment I mentioned was this ITER project, which is being currently under construction in France. That will produce power gain of 5 to 10 in continuous operation. So its temperature is slightly below this 14 keV or 150 million degrees centigrade that I mentioned, but you know, it's sufficiently close that it will produce a burning plasma, which will demonstrate for the first time a regime which will generate net energy yield. You can see a person for scale here. So this is a giant facility. This is around about, I don't know, 60 meters tall.
That's huge.
It's a very large facility. And so it comprises, I don't know whether I have a slide of it here, but it comprises, let's see. Yes, it does. I have some technical details on it at the moment. It's a growing consortium of nations and alliances. There's even a collaboration Australia agreement with Australia, which allows Australians to participate in this research at no cost, which is quite amazing that Australia was able to pull this off, because you know most of these international partners are pouring billions of dollars into this, and for Australia to do this at no cost is quite a feather in our cap. There was meant to be a contribution, which hasn't unfortunately materialized. It would be great if Australia was able to put some resource into this, but nonetheless, to get some access to the project at nearly no cost is quite incredible. So that's the ITER project at present. I'll say some things about it. So it's got nearly 300 volts of lightning in terms of current flowing through it. So that's about 15 mega amps. It's about a third of an Olympic swimming pool in terms of plasma volume. This field strength is 5.3 Tesla. So that's on axis here, on the magnetic axis. So to produce that, it has to be, you have superconducting coils, then niobium tin. So the whole device is shrouded in a cryostat and cooled down to liquid helium temperatures. So that's about 3 Kelvin or so. So you've got a temperature gradient going from 3 Kelvin to about 100 million Kelvin over about 3 meters or so. And it's got, 73 megawatts of auxiliary heating current drive. So this is large scale technology and large scale infrastructure. It is probably the most complex engineering project on the planet. In fact, it is almost certainly the most complex engineering project on the planet, because nothing like this has been attempted before. It's a world first. It's nearly 85% completed. Here's a picture from September 2023. As I said, it's located in Cadarache in France. There's the tokamak hall, I think. Where is it? Over here somewhere. And here's much of the offices and so forth. There's a giant substation. They bring much of the reactors online from nearby to power the experiment when it's in operation. So, you know, it's very high energy density, but it also requires a large amount of power to initiate. So I mentioned most of the discussion so far has been about this tokamak, which is this symmetric device where you generate this field line helicity by the internal current. There is another pathway of doing this, which is toroidal confinement, which is a stellarator, where you have a field line helicity created by a twist of field coils. This eliminates some disruptive current-driven instabilities, but it transforms the problem to an engineering challenge where the field coils are complicated. Nonetheless, there is significant international investment. Particularly Germany has invested in this W7X experiment, which is actually a reunification project. So they have a project which is now operating in Garching in former East Germany. And so this is a computationally optimized stellarator with what we would call low neoclassical transport, low current, good stability, and good flux surfaces. This was opened by Chancellor Merkel in February 2016. So that is now currently generating lots of exciting research results.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a question, I think, earlier about how do I turn this into a power plant? So here's whether it's my tokamak or stellarator, I have this toroidal confinement device, which is generating a large amount of heat. I then have a heat exchange device, which is a lithium, well, it would be some sort of heat blanket. In this case, it's a lithium blanket because the reason why it's made of, part of the blanket is made of lithium. The reason why is because I want to generate tritium, and I can do that by activating lithium by the neutrons that come out of the device. So there's a part of this, which is, these are not to scale, these pictures, but the point is that there is some lithium blanket, which is producing the required tritium to operate the machine into the in steady state. You have a heat exchanger, which generates steam and generates a turbine. So like fission, both fission and fusion are high heat, industrial heat devices. They produce a huge amount of heat, and that is used to generate electricity by a steam generator, but there are other industrial applications of high heat technologies as well.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a comment about radioactivity. I mentioned for the DT proton, a DT reaction. The DT reaction does generate this energetic neutron. This energetic neutron can activate the vessel wall, but if I look at the lifetime after shutdown for different technologies, here's a fission light water reactor with and others with. So if you look at the lifetime after shutdown, I don't know where the background ratio is on this, but you know, it remains significantly active after a long period of time. If you used reduced activation fluidic steel, it reduces by orders of magnitude, and indeed fusion vanadium after shutdown, it can approach sort of a timescale of 10 years or so before you need to before you can reprocess it to a greenfield site, and there are some technologies that are even lower than that. So Australia has lots of, Australia has lots of everything. It has lots of sun, it has lots of lithium, it has lots of vanadium, which is useful for fusion power as a structural material into the future. So the point that I want to make this is it's low level waste compared to fission, and it's relatively short-lived.
Yep.
So there are lots of studies of economics of fusion power, which compare it to different technologies. So lots of them are based either in Europe or the US. So the direct costs of construction, often the magnet component is probably the largest component. There are also components from nuclear technology in buildings, but the majority of the component is from the vacuum systems. And this is for a fusion power device, which is the fusion power is about 3.2 gigawatts, of which the gross electric is about 1.66 gigawatts. So that's basically comparable to a Raring. A Raring is about 1.6 gigawatt electric.
Mm-hmm.
So these devices are relatively large scale. in terms of power generation, and that's partly because of the physics scaling with regard that I mentioned before in terms of size. It may be the case that, second or third generation fusion reactors, you might be able to get them to a smaller scale, like SMRs, but, in the first instance, they will be very large scale energy producers. So this study, for example, shows, fusion is relatively, compared to renewables, fusion is lower impact than most of the renewable energy sector. You can put lots of uncertainties around this calculation. The main point that I really wanted to make with both of these slides is that there are calculations that suggest, which are peer-reviewed publications, that suggest that compared to renewables, fusion is lower impact. So here's wind offshore, wind onshore, solar large, PV, nuclear, natural gas and coal, and cheaper. So it is possible, these studies were done for Europe with a different socio-economic setting. It might be different for Australia, but the point is that there are costings which are peer-reviewed that do demonstrate that fusion has quite low impact. It's comparable to wind, and it's comparable to nuclear in terms of fuel production, in terms of direct cost, with much lower radioactive waste, nearly zero, well, zero direct waste. The waste is indirect, as I said, from activation of the vessel. Mm-hmm. So often I ask the question, when I give this presentation to various colleagues amongst the general science, they say, well, why should I care? Australia is a small nation, who cares what we do? Well, there are lots of reasons, one of which is that Australia is the largest fossil fuel exporter in the OECD, and our domestic emissions are the highest per capita in the OECD. So we are the worst of the OECD nations in terms of fossil fuel emissions. And so the point really is that, I've heard previous politicians say that, well, Australia is a small contributor, well, let's do nothing about it. It makes no difference anyway. Well, if everyone took that attitude, nothing would change. But the second point is that our exported emissions are enormous. The amount we dig up coal out of the ground and sell it overseas, and that burnt emission from overseas is enormous. So we have I think, a responsibility to try and limit that export and replace it with something else. And also, we have a responsibility to the planet. Climate change will affect Australia regardless. We have a responsibility to do something about it. So someone asked the question about, well, what are other nations doing? So the world is top-heavy. We know this in terms of people, industrial complex, and so forth. So the UK has a very strong approach to the development of fusion power delivery. It's invested over £700 million from 22 to 2025 to support the UK Atomic Energy Authority's cross-cutting edge research programs and facilities. It's released another £650 million into this Fusion Futures program to develop infrastructure skills, industrial and commercial opportunities. And it's also developed... Sorry? What was that?
You missed someone there, so if everyone can just keep muted, that would be good. Thanks, Matthew.
My point is the UK is investing a staggering amount of money into this technology. Australia invests almost nothing, but the UK and the US are investing huge amounts of money. The UK is investing this spherical tokamak for energy production. They've committed $240 million to 2024 for the first tranche of STEP. They've selected a site in West Burton in Nottinghamshire. The UK and US have signed a groundbreaking fusion energy partnership. And its aim is to develop resilient supply chains and promote skills development. And even Singapore has a growth in this area. The US program is enormous. The US program, this is funding over time. The US program spiked heavily in the late 1970s, primarily due to a gas shortage and an oil crisis in the Middle East. And so at that point, their fusion energy budget almost tripled. The idea was for it to continue. If it had maintained at this investment strategy, we would already have fusion power. But politics is fickle, particularly the US politics. And so it reduced to a platform of around about $500 million. It's now grown to the net total investment. I don't have the recent data, but I think it's around about 750 million per year. So the US and the UK are both major powers in this energy technology, as is Japan, China. India has a growing program in the space. And of course, Europe. Europe is a very big contributor to this space. There has also been a significant growth in the private sector. I mean, it's good that HB11 here because they represent part of that sector. That expansion has occurred since, well, I mean, really, it's only really been over since 2021 that there has been a substantial growth. They have had sort of US $4 billion since 2021. Most of this is in the US, to be honest, and Europe, which is fair. There is at least one company in Australia, HB11. There is another company in New Zealand, which is Open Star Technology, which is trying to realize a dipole magnetic field configuration. But this is new. This is changing the research investment structure for the future. There is lots of discussion about private-public partnerships. So you can see HB11 is marked on this as 2017. There are lots of more companies which are exploring a range of different technologies. It's probably true to say that most of them are magnetic confinement orientated, but not all of them. There's companies like HB11 and others that are also based on laser-based technology.
And Matthew, can you tell us about the university research just here in Australia? Is ANU?
Yeah, that's my next slide. So I can talk about ANU's activity or the Australia's activity.
Right.
So there is no formal government program. There is an Australian engagement with ITER, which is managed through ANSTO on behalf of Australian scientists, but there is no formal government program in this area. I lead Australia's only dedicated research group into this space. UNSW does have an activity, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily dedicated to fusion energy research. It's largely on the back of material science, which is also an important component of fusion energy going forward. There is other activities at Western Australia, University of Sydney in theory and modelling and mathematics. Curtin has a quite sophisticated atomic collision physics activity, as does Griffith. I haven't given justice to HB11 in this slide, but hopefully they will give an opportunity to present themselves and can offset that, but I have included it and acknowledged it. So they do have an activity in hydrogen boron fusion. And of course, UNSW has a growing material science activity. They are actually building a student-led and designed tokamak at the moment, I think with some support from HB11. And the purpose of that is to try and train nuclear engineers. So they're not trying to do research with it because, to do research requires an ITER scale type experiment. So forget it, it's not going to work. But as a engineering capability, it's interesting.
And this is, Matthew, this is one of the good things about AUKUS I see is that, talking about quantum computing as well, similar when we're talking about research and commercialization, the ability through AUKUS to lift all boats, as I mentioned earlier, share research capabilities, share through secure information lines as well. I think AUKUS is going to be a growing capability that Australia can certainly benefit from.
Yeah, so my next slide, in fact, addresses precisely that point. So you could ask the question, what has fusion got to do with nuclear submarines? So someone has asked me before, could you have a fusion-powered nuclear submarine? Well, probably not. ITER weighs like 60,000 tons, so I suspect that's not going to work. As a compact, relatively light, energy-dense reactor, it's very hard to get away from what effectively is an SMR reactor for a nuclear submarine. But you could ask the question, is there value add to fusion, to nuclear submarines from the fusion sector? And arguably there is in multiple different spaces. Probably the first of which is that, my colleague Steve Cowley at Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory long argued when he was in the UK that fusion is the miracle drug that attracts students to nuclear science. I think that's partly true. It attracted me because what you're trying to do is find a long-term energy solution for the planet. And so that attracts smart, altruistic people who want to make a difference. If I'm a smart, altruistic person who wants to make a difference to the world, I won't necessarily, to be honest, want to work on a nuclear submarine or develop a nuclear submarine because it's a weapon. I'm not interested in that. But I am interested in trying to do something good for the planet. And so, you know, it's a drug in some sense. So this is, you know, kind of a statement that's perhaps a little bit strong, a miracle drug. It attracts very good students to nuclear science, which is true. The other comment is, well, what are the common skill sets with nuclear submarines? So to get this information, I asked, so the UK, I mentioned, had a very strong program. They've appointed a Royal Navy Rear Admiral, who was the director of nuclear submarine acquisition for 2017 to 2020, to be director of that program. I asked him, he knows. He was responsible for the Royal Navy's submarine acquisition program for at least 4 years. And I also asked a chief engineer who was from the UK Royal Navy for 32 years. What are the common overlaps? And so the common overlaps, he said, well, look, they're both very complex systems. They're both very complicated systems. So complex systems modeling is an obvious overlap. They're not particularly interested in plasma physics because the conditions are different. But it is a clear demonstration of something which has lots of different intermoving components with physics models that describe the system. The physics is different, but you know, they're both a clear demonstration of a complex systems model. Neutronics, control systems, uncertainty for quantification, artificial intelligence. So this is where I think there is an overlap. You know, the cutting edge of fusion research is to develop things like digital twins to try and predict and respond and control to a fusion power plant under realistic conditions. I have a slide on that in a moment. Other components, there is an overlap in material science, particularly for structural analysis codes such as neutron embrittlement. There is a small amount of tritium that is generated during nuclear reactions in a submarine. Tritium is, you have to be careful with tritium because, you know, it is radioactive with a half-life of 12.5 years. You wouldn't want to drink it, so you have to be aware of it. Electrical power and storage, thermal cycling and hydraulic, system engineering, health physics, and safety case handling. So I asked the experts what's the overlap, and that's what they told me. I mentioned a digital twin. So this is something that's at the forefront. This is a colleague, an Australian colleague, General Rafi Nazikian from General Atomics, which is where Richard works. Richard is one of the directors of General Atomics. So what they are trying to do is use high fidelity physics models. So in order to sort of prescribe and describe and determine how a hot plasma will respond, ultimately it becomes very complicated, complex science, and becomes quite quickly a very big computational exercise. So you can do this in either high fidelity, which means lots of the correct physics, but it's very slow, or you can do this on, if you fold in AI, you can do it on a faster timescale, but you need to train it to something which is high fidelity, something with all the physics. So the point really is that a cutting edge component of fusion energy research is to try and predict and respond in real time using a digital twin, how the plasma will respond given the input data. And here's a token example, is that as an example, they were able to do 20,000 reconstructions of the plasma in 3 months versus 4,000 manual reconstruction in 12 years. So, and this one captured nearly all of the plasma data versus 0.1% of the plasma data in the manual reconstruction. So this is a paradigm shift. If you put in AI into this and you put large sophisticated models, you can use much more of the data and you can do it on much faster timescale. So this is potentially a paradigm shift, not only in control, but also in design. I mean, I'm part of a Simon's research project, which is seeing if you can use some of those new optimization techniques to try and find optimal designs of stellarators. So there's no guarantee that a tokamak is by any means the optimal magnetic field configuration. It's a field configuration. There are lots of others. Perhaps we can find one which is optimal in terms of power gain. And so the last slide I have is, you know, I like to think of implications when fusion power is realized, and hopefully it's realized, well, certainly within my lifetime. that would be the ideal objective. But you know, if you could realize that you could produce a large-scale energy production with essentially limitless fuel, no greenhouse gases, it's intrinsically safe. You cannot weaponize this technology. It makes no sense to weaponize it, at least using magnetic confinement pathways. I won't mention laser, but I mean, for magnetic confinement, this is the wrong way to develop a weapon. You wouldn't develop a weapon using this technology. It just makes no sense. It would be insane to do it. It would be a stupid amount of money there are much better ways to develop a weapon. I wouldn't do it this way. And it doesn't produce long-lived radioactive waste. It also produces industrial heat. So, it could do lots of things for the planet. You could ask the question, what does ubiquitous near limitless clean power do? What could it do? Well, it could stop wars, for example. I mean, most wars are ultimately related to some form of resource, with the exception possibly of the Middle East, which appears to be entirely ideological. But it could lift the developing world out of poverty. It could power large-scale desalination. Maybe it could remove some of the CO2 from the atmosphere. Hey, it might be better not to put it there in the first place by planting and also plant trees. But, it could remove some of the CO2 from the atmosphere. And I'm a Trekkie at heart. It could enable extrasolar space travel. But, that's in the very long term. But I hope I've given you a snapshot of what fusion energy is and what it can offer. I focused primarily on toroidal magnetic confinement and mostly on the tokamak pathway. I talked a little bit about the stellarator, but I did give reference to the other broader technology pathways as well. So I'm very happy to take questions and or comments.
That's great, Richard. If you want to stop sharing the screen and we can...
Matthew, yeah, I'll stop sharing
Matthew,
the screen.
sorry, yeah.
That's all right.
And we have a question from Mac Wilson. Mac, you're coming in from Adelaide, I think, so far away.
Yes, that's correct. I thought I'd just quickly chime in, more of a comment and anything, but wonderful. Thank you very much, Matthew, for the excellent summary of the industry. But I'd just like to acknowledge that with our colleagues HB 11 for inertial confinement, we're based in Japan, but we're also beginning operations here in Australia to assist with collegial development in this area. So we're involved with the laser inertial confinement, and we're doing the 10 hertz deuterium and tritium model. So I just thought I'd just let you know we're around. And,
yeah, I did know about that. I think I was told about that by HB 11 people before. So yeah, I did know that there was a Japanese connection. I wasn't sure whether it was active now, but that's great to hear from you and great to see you.
Excellent.
And Matthew, it seems like we can never say never anymore. I read an article this week that Elon Musk is full underway and planning to have 1 million people living and working on the moon by 2030. So 6 years from now. It seems remarkable, but you can never say never to what Elon's achieved in his life. So if that's the case, on one of our previous nuclear sessions, we had a company out of Adelaide making a nuclear battery. And they were using waste medical isotopes to power this nuclear battery with a vision for remote mining sites. But now that Australia is a signatory to the NASA Moon to Mars mission, they see an opportunity for this Australian technology, and we can manufacture it here in country and export it out of this world. So that's the sort of stuff we've been talking about on the sessions here. It's great to have you explaining more about fusion. We've got our nuclear skills course we're holding next month in regional Queensland at the Banana Shire Council offices. We've got some community members coming together, and I think Jasmine Diab is on the Zoom session with us today. Jazz Diab is a nuclear engineer. She's a member of our advisory board at the AUKUS Forum and a lieutenant colonel in the Australian Army. So we're looking forward to sharing nuclear industry insights and what it can take to lift skills here in Australia. But I guess my question, long-winded question to you, is around the timeline, and you've touched on that through your presentation, but in a lot of these sessions and conversations that we've been having with the Nuclear Taskforce, it's been said that SMRs will come online, the small modular reactors, and be commercially around for the next 25 years as the technology evolves, and they have about an 80-year lifespan, which is good. But then it's also been said to us that fusion technology will probably take about another 25 years to become commercially viable. Would you share that view, or could you share with us what you hear as the commercial insights around the world?
Well, there has been a long-standing comment that fusion is always 30 years away. But this time I think it really is 30 years away. I think, and it's only about 30 years away, 25 to 30 years away. I think it's, there has been now significant information has been gathered about how you operate a burning plasma. We haven't done it completely. We still need to build ITER and demonstrate that it works. But, you know, the combination of that public sector demonstration of capability together with the willingness of the private sector to take perhaps slightly more risky adventures relative to the public sector to try and realize something means that it probably is around 25 to 30 years away. And, you know, the UK, as I said, has gone gangbusters in this. They're pouring a huge amount of money into this technology to demonstrate that it will work. Their STEP project is very ambitious. I mean, they aim to have power to the grid by 2040. I suspect that will be extremely challenging to meet, but there is a lot of investment, and there is a lot of reason to believe that on a timescale of 25 to 30 years, that fusion power will be demonstrated. Will it be competitive to other technologies? I really don't know. I mentioned those slides there that showed that it could be competitive. That was to demonstrate there are feasibility studies to demonstrate that it could be competitive. Is it likely to be competitive in the first instance? Probably not. And simply because if you look back at the technology paths of any emergent technology, I mean, going right back to the car engine. The car engine was hopelessly inefficient when it was first realized. It was only under latter development pathways and innovations and over time that it became the extremely highly efficient device that it is today. And so I suspect in the first instance that it probably won't be commercially viable as an independent entity. But you know, if we took that attitude to everything, we would never evolve or would never try new technologies. So I suspect it would be available on 25 to 30 years. Would the first generation be competitive? I'd be dubious about that, to be honest.
From my perspective, it's just great to know that we have such great research going on around the country here. You want to be at the forefront. So I think, you know, congratulations on your efforts, and for the other people here on the Zoom call too that are part of these efforts. You know, it's a great thing. We want to hear more from you. Ian Hudson is on the task force, and Ian and I've had various factory visits where welding has become a big thing. So we visited one large place that had welding capability. They're saying if you're going to put reactors together, you need welding skills. But this is where the ICN Gateway can help for companies to register, and we're certainly encouraging Australian industry to get on the ICN Gateway for AUKUS and other activities. But Ian, pretty good stuff we're hearing here.
Yeah, quite amazing. I feel like I've been washed over by a tidal wave with information, but it really makes it clear. I did ask my daughter, who's a scientist, on the weekend, well, what's the difference between fusion and fission? And you went much beyond that. So thanks for that, Matthew. I'm interested in the materials. I know you mentioned beryllium tungsten as one of the materials, but is that the only one that's being used, or are there other contenders for the mate?
Yeah, so materials is a big deal for fusion, partly because you have to, certainly for total magnetic confinement, because you have to manufacture a material that's going to withstand both this high neutron and high thermal flux. And so for ITER, for example, they did have a combination of both tungsten for what's called the diverter, which is this, you have this strike point where you have field lines hitting the diverter with very high thermal flux. And then they had, for the rest of the device, they had beryllium, which was relatively low atomic number steel for the rest of the war. They've now changed it completely to a tungsten device. So tungsten is very hard-wearing and resilient, and that's one of the reasons for doing it. At these very high temperatures, you can get tungsten. What you can get is ablation of the first wall into the plasma. And because tungsten is very high atomic number, what that means is that a lot of the energy can be sunk into ionizing all the states of tungsten. So when you use a high Z or a high atomic number material, it can be a heat sink to the plasma itself. But yes, materials is a big deal, particularly for realizing a machine that will withstand this high heat flux to the diverter and also be neutron resilient. And that's where, Australia has these large supplies of vanadium. It'd be great if Australia didn't just dig stuff out of the ground and sell it to another country and then buy it back as a car. I mean, that's what Australia's always done. It'd be wonderful.
Jamie, I think
It'd be
Jamie,
wonderful if it could build perhaps part of a blanket
Mm.
and sell it using reduced activation vanadium steel, or as an example. There are lots of other examples, but manufacturing is one of Australia's great unfortunate tragedies in some respect.
It's coming back.
I hope it's coming back because that's the value add pathway.
in my mind, it's got to be regional as well. And so it's great that Jamie can join us, because when we talk about one of the parts of Pillar 2 for AUKUS is critical minerals. And New South Wales in particular has great resources under the ground that we can unlock. We know that Kim Beazley, our former Defence Minister and former Ambassador to the US, has talked about value adding, to your point, Matthew, why do we dig it up and ship it off? But Jamie, great opportunities around critical minerals and what regional Australia can do for energy.
Look, in manufacturing, even our agricultural product, it's just criminal to see the raw product that leaves the country without that value add. Those job creation and wealth within our own state of New South Wales, it's really disappointing. But that, that's another conversation. Matthew, this is the first time I've really had a good conversation around fusion. It does sound like it's some way off, and it will be behind nuclear power, small reactors in Australia, should the moratorium be lifted. Not understanding a lot about fusion, is it also covered where currently in Australia we wouldn't be able to build a fusion plant similar to a nuclear plant? And if or when it is the moratorium is lifted, will that also pave the way for fusion in the future?
That's an interesting question. I haven't actually looked at the legislation. So it's not clear to me whether the legislation articulates, I think the legislation refers to nuclear, but it doesn't identify whether it's fission or fusion. So it's not clear to me. My gut feeling, without looking at the legislation, I think we should ask a lawyer or perhaps someone who's familiar with it to tell us. My first response is it probably is covered by that legislation, but it's possible it's not. And so I actually don't know the answer to that point.
Well, thankfully, one of the members of our nuclear task force is Kirsty Braybon, who is a nuclear lawyer. And so from that, we'll certainly put out a message to Kirsty and find out. I think that's a great question, Jamie.
Sorry, Matthew, the other question I've got too is when it comes to power generation, it's obviously a lack of space in the metropolitan areas. So it's regional communities that take that responsibility, I guess, for the location of the generation and the distribution. There's a lot of conflict at the moment with the boom of the renewable projects that are right across Australia, with wind and solar in particular, and the new distribution network. So a lot of conflict within regional communities around that. So I think as fusion goes forward, to be able to be almost modularised would be ideal if it will replace nuclear into the future. So we can basically place them where the network already is of distribution system of that power that's generated. I know that that's visionary and a long way off as we're talking about with this technology, but I guess that must be understood too as it's further developed, that for it to really work, the distribution network has to be something viable as well.
That's true. So both fission and fusion are energy dense. And they are relatively large scale energy producers. Conventional fission is similar to the size of a fusion power plant, at least for the designs that we're looking at here, around about, it's a Raring scale type power plant. Both of those, they don't have the same, they're not distributed, they're not distributed low energy density supply, which is what renewables is. It's high energy density centered supply. The type of power utility that it's useful for powering is cities and civilizations. So you can ask me the question, is solar PV going to power New York or Tokyo? I very much doubt it. So it requires a large scale energy dense supply to do it. And unless you address the world's energy supply emissions, you're not addressing climate change at all.
Well, Matthew, that brings us to a close. We're having these sessions on the third Wednesday of every month. So we're looking forward to next month with some more great guest speakers. And I see Hillary's here from the Manufacturing Industry Skills Alliance. So we need to get you involved in this next one as well, mate. So I'll touch base with you over the next week. And but thanks to the members of our nuclear task force, I'm really glad we could be joined in the conversation today by the president of the Country Mayors Association, Jamie Chaffee, and Ian Hudson, the executive director for the Industry Capability Network. And Matthew, your insights today have been very beneficial, and I'm sure it's going to raise a lot of questions on our LinkedIn platform. So check out the Nuclear Task Force on LinkedIn and get involved with the AUKUS Forum, where we're doing much more each and every month. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you.
again. Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Matthew.